It was a cold winter day in 1919, and the streets of Boston's North End were alive with their usual buzz of activity. But no one could have predicted how quickly that day would turn into chaos, etched forever in history as the Great Molasses Flood. Without warning, a giant storage tank holding millions of gallons of molasses collapsed in an instant. The sticky syrup, intended for making industrial alcohol, turned into a disaster within seconds. Step into T.C channel, where every brain-bending mystery unfolds, one clue at a time. Don't just watch, subscribe now and challenge yourself to crack the case. A flood of molasses, 4 meters high, raced through the streets at terrifying speed. People only had time to hear the screech of metal tearing apart, followed by a thunderous roar, before the wave crashed into everything. No one could escape. The sticky brown flood trapped people, buildings, and even animals. As the syrup cooled, it hardened like cement, locking everything in place. Nearby, a man named Mr. Brooke was hanging laundry on his balcony. He heard a strange, creaking sound growing louder, like a warning he didn't yet understand. Suddenly, a powerful gust of air shattered windows around him. Brooke ducked instinctively, just as glass shards flew past him. When he stood up, he saw it, a massive wave of molasses charging straight toward him. He ran to the edge of the balcony, his heart sinking as he spotted his wife and son below, standing frozen in shock. Before they could move, the wave hit. The syrup was so thick and heavy, it locked them in place. Even his son, a boxer known for his strength, was completely stuck. Brooke bolted downstairs, fighting against the sticky flood with every step. The molasses clung to him, like invisible hands pulling him back. He finally reached his son, grabbed hold of him, and pulled with everything he had. His son's face was covered in syrup, his eyes glued shut, and he was barely breathing through the syrup. But Brooke's wife was still trapped. She was just a few meters away, desperately trying to free herself. Her hands moved slower and slower, until, finally, they stopped. Brooke tried to push forward, but the molasses had turned solid around him, pinning him in place. He could do nothing but watch, helpless, as his wife disappeared, a heartbreaking sight he would never forget. The streets were frozen in chaos. Molasses burst from the broken tank, spreading everywhere, covering everything in its path. Back then, most people used horse-drawn carriages to get around. Cars were rare, but the wave of molasses didn't care. It coated carriages, people, and animals, trapping them in place. Molasses isn't like water. Water recedes, and you can get back up. But molasses grabs hold, sticks to you like glue, and won't let go. The streets became a giant trap, with no escape. Near the docks, a retired naval ship was anchored, used by a military academy. Cadets were training on board when they saw the flood tearing through the streets. "Let's help," the instructor yelled, and they rushed to the scene. By the time they arrived, the molasses had hardened. It was like walking on solid ground. Every step was slow and heavy. When they looked around, the scene left them speechless. People were frozen in place. Some had their heads and arms above the surface, struggling to breathe. Others were completely trapped, helpless, their faces showing desperation. They looked like insects sealed in amber, caught with no way out. The horses were no better. These strong, powerful animals couldn't move at all. Some were still alive, their eyes following the rescuers' movements, but their bodies wouldn't budge. It was eerie, creating an unsettling scene, their silent, unblinking eyes fixed in place. Rescue was nearly impossible. People were stuck as if encased in stone. The cadets dug, pulled, and clawed at the hardened molasses. But after hours of effort, they saved only about 20 people. The fire station and police department were just too close to the tank. When it exploded, their buildings were destroyed instantly. Firefighters and officers were trapped themselves, unable to help. By late afternoon, volunteers and rescue teams finally arrived. But the molasses had completely solidified, making their efforts nearly impossible. In the end, 21 people died, and over 150 were injured. Most of the deaths happened in the middle of the street, where the molasses was thickest and hardest to escape. Even years later, on hot summer days, you could still smell the faint sweetness of molasses in the air. For Boston, this disaster became a permanent scar, etched into its history forever. This wasn't just some random accident. It was rooted in a chain of bad decisions in history. In 1919, a massive molasses tank stood at the center of the disaster. But its story began 4 years earlier, in 1915, during the height of World War I. Back then, smokeless powder was a key part of the war effort, and it relied on ethanol, industrial alcohol. Molasses, the main ingredient for ethanol, was stockpiled in huge quantities to keep up with wartime demand. At the same time, America was preparing for Prohibition. In 1919, the government announced that alcohol sales would be banned nationwide, starting the next year. This news sent demand for rum skyrocketing. Molasses, essential for making rum, became a hot commodity for underground distilleries. By fermenting and distilling it, they could produce high-proof alcohol and make a fortune. With molasses prices soaring, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company saw a golden opportunity. They decided to build a massive tank at Boston Harbor to store what they called liquid gold. Boston Harbor made perfect sense. It had railroads connecting it to the rest of the country and access to major shipping routes. It was fast, cheap, and profitable. But the company was in a rush. They gave themselves only 2 months to finish the tank. For something this massive, it was a dangerously tight timeline. And it gets worse. The person in charge of construction? Not an engineer, not even someone with experience. He was an accountant. The design was sloppy, construction rushed, and no one bothered to test if the tank could hold the weight. As soon as it was finished, they filled it with molasses, untested and unchecked. Within a year, cracks started to show. Molasses leaked from the seams, and locals noticed. People complained, but the company brushed it off. Instead of fixing the issue, they painted the tank to match the color of the molasses, hiding the leaks. It was a disaster waiting to happen. And on January 15, 1919, it did. The tank couldn't hold the pressure anymore. It burst, unleashing chaos, and leaving permanent scars on Boston's history. It all started when a cargo ship unloaded 2.7 million liters of molasses at the harbor. To keep it from solidifying in the freezing cold, the molasses was heated before being stored. But Boston winters can be unpredictable. Temperatures suddenly shot up, jumping from -17 degrees Celsius to 5 degrees Celsius in no time. Locals called it a false spring, and it triggered a perfect storm. The sudden temperature shift caused the molasses to ferment, releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide inside the tank. The pressure kept climbing, and the tank, already riddled with cracks, just couldn't take it anymore. With a loud crack, it gave way, sending a wave of molasses surging through the streets, covering everything in its path. Metal bolts were launched under immense pressure, and one came dangerously close to hitting Mr. Burkett. Fortunately, he was lucky enough to avoid it. Not everyone was so fortunate. This disaster claimed 21 lives, and countless animals were caught in the sticky flood, unable to break free. When rescue crews arrived, they found people and animals preserved in hardened molasses, as if time had stopped. This tragedy left a permanent scar on Boston's history. It was a harsh reminder of the dangers of negligence and the cost of cutting corners on safety. Though decades have passed, the lessons from that day still resonate today. If you love stories like this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. What do you think was the real cause of this disaster? Or let us know in the comments what other fascinating events from history you'd like us to cover. Hit subscribe, and let's explore more incredible stories together.